environmental change is real, and it's not just something that will threaten a distant future. It's affecting people today, and it's going to affect you and me, my children, your children, in their lifetime.
I must say that I'm really more concerned today than ever about the state of the world.
The question is not what can be done. The question is what must be done.
If you get an opportunity to move on some environmental problem, move quickly.
We have to do more than discuss. We have to act.
At 80, Maurice Strong is still going strong for the environment. He's the man who spearheaded the historic UN Conference on the Human Environment held in Stockholm in 1972.
The UN conference opened at Sweden's historic Parliament building with the intention of publicizing the fragile nature of our planet and drawing up guidelines for its protection.
The meeting that set the stage for a new phase of international cooperation on the environment.
The problems we identified 40 years ago have now become far more acute, to the point where they literally threaten the future of life on Earth. And so we have to give them a completely new sense of urgency. We have to put them at the top of our priority. Our survival is now at issue.
Across the Atlantic in the US, a strong environmental movement was already taking shape even before the Stockholm meeting. The country had already passed legislations to regulate water and air quality, culminating in the establishment of the Environment Protection Agency, EPA, in 1970. William Ruckelshaus was the founding administrator of the agency, an organization whose creation was the symbol of America's environmental leadership in the 70s.
We were able to do a number of things to push industry and to push municipalities and others to improve the environment, and there was public support for that. And that public support had waned toward the end of that decade and into the next, and particularly into the 90s, and it was harder for those agencies to make progress. We also had picked off what we think of as low-hanging fruit. There were big polluters. They were very visible. They were not supported by the public in what they were doing. So going after them in the courts to enforce the standards was relatively easy at the early part of this, and it became much harder when you could see the economic difficulties that occurred as a result of that environmental pressure.
And indeed, coming into Stockholm, the US was a natural lead at the conference and played a key role in the creation of the UN Environment Program UNEP as the anchor institution for global environmental management. John McDonald is now 87 years old. He was secretary of the US delegation at the Stockholm meeting and is largely credited with drafting the text that gave rise to UNEP.
In the middle of 1971, I actually wrote out 4 resolutions to take to the 4th Preparatory Committee for Stockholm. And those 4 call for the creation of UN Environment Program and outline the terms of reference of the intergovernmental mechanism. The 2nd resolution defined the role of the Secretariat and what UNEP should do. The 3rd resolution set up a special fund for development for projects in the environmental field, which is a voluntary contribution, not an assessed contribution as part of the UN budget. And the 4th was an interagency coordinating mechanism within the UN system to bring in the various agencies like WHO and ILO and FAO who had pieces of the environment, but bring them together, coordinating committee chaired by the head of UNEP to ensure that there was no overlap and duplication. And those 4 resolutions basically were finally adopted. 95% of them were adopted by the conference in Stockholm, and so UNEP was launched by the General Assembly on December 15, 1972.
These environmental pioneers represent the single most important element that has been missing in the debate on environmental governance: leadership.
They're different, aren't they? These people are in their 80s. They're still in their suits and ties every day. They go to the office 6 days a week. I think that is a very strong message to our generation, which is used to media from all parts of the world, instantaneous. We need to be focused, to be committed, and just go at it.
These men and women are now largely in their twilight years, but they are still eager to pass on the baton to a new generation of environmental leaders. That is the platform the Global Environmental Governance Project has sought to create. On the shores of Lake Geneva, a rare gathering cutting across generations. This is the Global Environmental Governance Forum in this resort village of Glion in Switzerland.
At every table, you have the emerging environmental leaders that were selected through a competitive process. We have tried to gather here the past, the present, and the future.
We will not change things unless we are passionately convinced that we need to do something about that.
The meeting's agenda is to take stock and inspire a new environmental leadership.
To be a leader, you have to be uncomfortable with the status quo.
As far as leadership goes, I think it's easy to be a leader, but I don't think it's easy to be a sustained leader.
It is recognizing differences. It's recognizing contestation in terms of the interests. It's recognizing conflict. But at the end of the day, looking at the convergence points, knowing that there are those areas we can work together despite the differences.
I believe that we have access to all of the tools and technologies now to build social networks, build social movements, give people access to transparent and current information that they didn't have access to 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago when they were working on these things.
There's a strong concern that the dominant institutions for what we're calling global environmental governance have become a bit too inward-looking, have become a bit too bureaucratic, a bit too encrusted. The people working in these institutions have become too much of a tight circle.
Political power is so important. Either we train the future political leaders to understand this issue, or we train the environmental leaders and make them into these critical positions so that in future, when they execute their mandate, they will always bring in these environmental elements.
Welcome all of you here to this historic segment of the Global Environmental Governance Forum.
And for the first time, all the past executive directors of UNEP were lined up on a panel to reflect on the past and peer into the future.
The very first one is, what is it that member states want? Do they want an organization that is a sustainable development organization, or do they want an organization that is an environmental organization with the responsibility for making environmental input into the broader sustainable development question?
That the current economic crisis and the environmental crisis, most not exclusively confined to the climate change crisis, but of which that is the main manifestation, These actually have their roots in the same thing. They are not separate and competing issues. They both have their roots in the fact that our own economy is simply not workable.
I suggest that this distinguished group bring back to the distinguished governments of the world the principles they themselves declared since 1972. Go back to the Stockholm Conference, to the Rio Conference, to the Nairobi Conference in 1997, Millennium Development Goals, 2002 Johannesburg Principles. What did they implement out of these lofty words? None.
The green economy has arrived. The question is, will those who, in a sense, have a vested interest in the current economy, in the current energy infrastructure, in the current transport system, because they've invested in it, they've chosen certain technologies, they've anticipated certain markets, will we allow them to hold us back from a future where our jobs of tomorrow, where our markets of tomorrow, where our livelihoods of tomorrow are going to come from?
I went around the world and met with each of the executive directors for my own research on why UNEP has performed, why it has had challenges. And when I met with each and every one individually, in Cairo, in Beijing, in Toronto, each and every one was convinced that it would be useful for them to come together and pass on the wisdom, but also learn from each other.
But even with such a rich history, the nearly 40 years of UNEP's existence have hardly turned the tide on environmental degradation. And now many scholars and environmental leaders believe it's time for a rethink.
We've been doing this now for 40 years, and yet what we've seen, unfortunately, is that the environmental situation has continued to deteriorate and continued to deteriorate rapidly. So I think we have to ask, why is this happening? I mean, how could we be doing all the things that we think need to be done and we're still losing? And in fact, we're losing so much that we're really on the verge of ruining the planet, quite literally.
Indeed, the failure by the Copenhagen summit to agree on a new climate deal exemplified the growing crisis of governance at the international level and the failure of existing institutions to stem the tide.
What we need is to advance transformative principle in a managed way, and this is what I would simply call radical incrementalism. It's radical in the sense that, okay, we are moving certain pillars and redefining them, okay? It's incremental in the sense that we take one block at a time, because otherwise we will produce simple chaos.
We need to rethink the environmental governance structure. We need to think about the platforms in the United Nations system that allow countries to cooperate with one another on these issues. Because in the year 2012, the world will meet 20 years after the Rio Earth Summit, again in Rio, to review whether it has succeeded in the objectives that it laid out then. And clearly the role of the UN, and within it the role of the United Nations Environment Programme, will be one of the central questions.
The growing search for an effective governance formula has coincided with a wobbly global economy. And now many believe that the changes required will have to start with the very manner in which that economy is structured.
We're in a system which forces us to overcompromise with economic priorities, with the growth priority, over and over again. And basically, for those of us who are in the rich countries and the affluent countries, it's time to get away from this model that always prioritizes economic growth over everything else.
For these trailblazers, it has been down to the basics of life, such as seizing the moment.
If you get an opportunity to move on some environmental problem, move quickly and move decisively and move in a way that doesn't brook for any resistance.
Sheer tenacity.
But I have patience, and I believe that a lot can be accomplished over time. I know how to listen to people and get their ideas and suggestions, and I try to be less arrogant than most Americans. So those are the three principles that have helped me going.
Faith in a new generation.
It is absolutely wonderful to see that a younger generation is now inheriting all the mess which we created, but is absolutely capable, and I am 100% convinced that the young generation is capable to clean up the mess which we created.
And never giving up.
I am now 80 years old, but I'm still going, and as long as I go, I'm going to do my best to make sure that all the people in the world have a secure future.
And that message is hitting home.
I commit to leading by example.
I commit to work with the Aspen Institute to bring attention to the need for accountability for all the nations to own up to their commitments in international environmental governance.
I commit to do research on global environment governance and China's participation.
My commitment is to ensure that the institutions for global environmental governance are made available and accessible to the underprivileged communities in Vietnam.
I will link the global debate on international environmental governance with the local level.
I commit to nurture young social workers to create an environmentally just society.